The year is 476, 520 years after Julius Caesar fell on the steps of Pompey's hall, 412 years after Nero's Rome burned in the summer wind, 397 years after the mountain in Campania buried the city of Pompeii in ash. The world that had built those events is over now. The republic Caesar destroyed is a memory of memories. The empire that grew from his death has spread across 3 continents, has lasted 20 generations, and is, at last, coming to its end. Tonight, we travel to the final year of the Western Roman Empire, to a fortified palace city by the Adriatic Sea, surrounded by salt marshes and high stone walls, to a teenage boy on an imperial throne who is not the son of any emperor, who has held his crown for less than a year, to a barbarian general at the gates leading an army of soldiers who have served Rome for generations and who, today, are tired of waiting for what they were promised. This is not the story of an empire collapsing in a single year. The Roman Empire did not fall in 476. It had been falling for 200 years. It had been falling, in some sense, since the day Caesar declared himself dictator for life. But there is a date, a single autumn day, the 4th of September, when something formal ends. When the last Roman emperor in the West takes off his crown. When a Germanic chieftain stands in his place, when a long, slow, complicated thing is, finally, written down as having ended. Tonight, we travel to that day, to the empire that was, to the boy emperor whose name was Romulus, like the founder of Rome 1,000 years before, to the soldier from a tribe whose name we still argue about, to the marble palaces of Ravenna, where the imperial insignia were packed into a wooden chest and sent east to Constantinople, where they would never be claimed again. The year is 476. Rome is 1,200 years old. The empire is 500 years old. The end is here. Close your eyes. Let the long story begin. To understand 476, we must understand that nothing happened that year that had not been happening for centuries. The Roman Empire, at its height, was the largest political body the Western world had ever seen. It stretched from the foggy hills of Britain, across the cold rivers of Gaul, through the mountains of Germania, to the deserts of Egypt, the cedar forests of Lebanon, the sun-baked shores of North Africa. It contained perhaps 60 million people. It contained more than 100 languages. It contained dozens of religions, hundreds of cities, thousands of villages, millions of farms. It was held together by 3 things: by an army of perhaps 400,000 soldiers scattered along its borders, by a network of roads, 50,000 miles of them paved with stone, running from one end of the empire to the other, and by the idea of Rome itself, the idea that no matter where you lived, no matter what language you spoke, no matter what gods you worshipped, you were a Roman, and Rome was the center of the civilized world. For 200 years, from the time of Augustus to the time of Marcus Aurelius, this system worked. The empire grew, the roads were maintained, the army held the borders, the cities flourished. Latin and Greek were spoken in markets from York to Alexandria. Coins minted in Rome were used in towns whose Roman emperors had never visited. Then, in the late 2nd century, something began to go wrong. The first sign was a plague. In the year 165, 311 years before our story, Soldiers returning from a campaign in the east brought with them a disease the Romans had never seen. Modern historians think it was smallpox, perhaps measles. The Romans called it the Antonine Plague, after the emperor on the throne when it arrived. It killed perhaps 5 million people, maybe more. It spread along the roads, from city to city, leaping from soldier to merchant to peasant. It killed the emperor Marcus Aurelius's co-emperor. It killed Marcus Aurelius himself eventually in the year 180. After the plague, the empire was never quite the same. The army was under strength, the treasury was depleted, the borders were thinner. The barbarian peoples beyond those borders, Germanic tribes who had been kept out by Roman strength for 2 centuries, began slowly to push. 100 years after the plague, the empire was in open crisis. There were 50 different emperors in 50 years. Some lasted weeks. The army made and unmade its own rulers. The Persians invaded from the east. The Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine. Cities began to build walls, something they had not bothered with for centuries. The Roman world was, for the first time, becoming afraid. This was the first death of Rome. It is sometimes called the crisis of the 3rd century. The empire survived it, just barely, but it survived as a different kind of empire. Smaller, poorer, more militarized, less confident. The old self-assurance, the idea that the world existed to be Roman, was beginning to fade. In the year 285, 190 years before our story, the Emperor Diocletian made a decision that would, in time, change the shape of the world. The empire, he decided, was too large to be ruled by one man. He divided it. He gave the eastern half, the richer half, the half with the great cities of Antioch and Alexandria and Constantinople and Athens, to a fellow general. He kept the western half, the half with Rome itself, with Gaul, with Britain, with the Spanish provinces, for himself. They would rule as equals. They would coordinate their defenses. They would, together, hold the empire together. It worked for a time. After Diocletian, the empire was sometimes one again, sometimes two. The split came and went, depending on who held power. But the underlying truth, that the East was richer and the West was poorer, and that the West needed the East more than the East needed the West, that truth never went away. In the year 324, 152 years before our story, the Emperor Constantine ended the splits briefly by becoming sole emperor of both halves. He founded a new capital city in the east, on the Bosphorus, where Europe meets Asia. He named it after himself Constantinople, the city of Constantine. Constantinople was a different kind of capital. It was newer than Rome. It was richer than Rome. It was by the year 400 the true center of imperial power. And the West, Italy, Gaul, Britain, Spain, was increasingly the poorer cousin. The Eastern Empire would last another 1,000 years. The Western Empire was already, by the early 5th century, on its long, slow path toward 476. Constantine also did something else. He made Christianity the favored religion of the empire. This had been a small movement 3 centuries earlier when Caesar's heir Augustus ruled, and a Jewish prophet was crucified in a far province of the Eastern Empire. It had been a persecuted movement 2 centuries earlier when Nero burned the Christians as scapegoats for his fire. It had been a growing, stubbornly secret movement for 300 years. Now, with Constantine, it became the religion of the imperial court. By the end of the 4th century, it would be the official religion of the empire. Pagan temples would be closed. The old gods of Rome would be banned. The Vestal virgins, who had tended the eternal flame of Rome for over 1,000 years, would be sent home. The flame itself would be allowed to go out. This is one of the great transformations of human history. We will not tell its full story tonight, but it is part of the story of 476. Because by the year of Romulus Augustulus, the Roman world was no longer the world of Caesar or Nero. It was a Christian world, a world whose official religion taught that the kingdoms of men were temporary, that the only true city was the city of God, that the end of the world was coming, a world in which the fall of Rome would be understood by many of its inhabitants as a punishment for sin, or as a sign of the approaching apocalypse, or simply as one more proof that the things of this world do not last. The borders of the Western Empire in the late 4th century were under increasing pressure. For 4 centuries, the great frontier of Rome in the north had been the river Rhine, in modern France and Germany, and the river Danube, running across modern Austria, Hungary, Romania. Beyond these rivers lay a world the Romans called Germania, a vast forested wilderness inhabited by dozens of tribes the Romans had never fully conquered and never fully understood. The Germanic tribes had names: the Goths, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, the Burgundians, the Franks, the Alans, the Suebi, the Heruli, the Lombards, the Saxons, the Angles. They spoke related languages, early forms of German and Gothic and English. They had their own customs, their own kings, their own gods. They had for centuries traded with the Romans, fought with the Romans, sometimes served as auxiliaries in the Roman army, sometimes raided Roman towns and disappeared back into the forests. The Romans had treated them mostly with cautious contempt. They were barbarians, a Greek word originally that simply meant people who do not speak Greek. They were uncivilized. They were dirty. They were drunk. They were, the Romans believed, naturally inferior to the citizens of Rome. But in the late 4th century, something began to push these tribes from behind. A new people was coming out of the steppes of Central Asia. Nomadic horsemen, skilled archers, cruel by Roman standards, even by Germanic standards. Their faces, the Roman historian Ammianus wrote, did not look human. Their language was incomprehensible. They had never been seen in Europe before. They were the Huns. The Huns did not at first attack the Roman Empire. They attacked the Germanic tribes who lived just beyond the Roman border. The Goths, in particular, took the brunt of it. By the year 376, the Goths, fleeing the Hunnish onslaught, were pressed up against the Danube, looking across the river at the Roman provinces of the empire. They sent ambassadors to the Roman Emperor Valens. They asked for permission to cross the river. They asked for land inside the empire, where they could settle and farm and serve the Roman state. Valens agreed. It was, in retrospect, the beginning of the end. The Goths crossed the Danube. They were settled by Roman officials in the Balkans, but the officials cheated them. They sold the Goths bad food at high prices. They abused them. They stole their children. The Goths finally rose in revolt. In the year 378, almost 100 years before our story, the Roman army, led by the Emperor Valens himself, met the Gothic army at a place called Adrianople in modern Turkey. The Romans expected an easy victory. The Romans had won every major battle against barbarians for 400 years. They lost. Valens was killed. 2/3 of the Roman army was destroyed. It was the worst Roman military defeat in 2 centuries. And the Goths, for the first time, were not just visiting the empire. They were inside it. They were settled there, and nobody could make them leave. Imagine for a moment what it was like to live through these years. Not in Rome, not in Ravenna, not in any of the great cities, but in a small farming village, somewhere in southern Gaul or northern Italy or Spanish Hispania. You are a farmer, or your father is a farmer, or your grandfather was. Your family has farmed the same land, perhaps, for 10 generations. You speak Latin. You worship the local saints, perhaps the old gods too, in private. You pay your taxes to a Roman tax collector who comes through twice a year. You buy salt at a market town 6 miles away. You have never been to Rome. You have never seen the emperor. You will, in your lifetime, never travel more than 30 miles from the place where you were born. But things are changing. The tax collector now comes more often. The taxes are higher. The coins he demands are now sometimes refused at the markets because they have been debased. Too much copper, not enough silver. The roads, which used to be patrolled by Roman soldiers, are now sometimes empty for weeks. Bandits operate in some valleys. The villa of the wealthy man on the next hill has been abandoned. He moved to a fortified town, taking his slaves with him, and left his fields to revert to forest. You hear stories. A neighbor's son, who joined the Roman army 10 years ago, comes home for a visit. He says he served alongside Goths, Franks, Burgundians. He says half the soldiers in his unit do not speak Latin. He says his commanding officer was a Vandal. You hear that the great city of Treves on the Mosel has been sacked, then rebuilt, then sacked again. You hear that the bishops have taken over many functions of government because the imperial officials no longer come. You hear that the Goths have settled in southern Gaul, that their king now rules from Toulouse, where a Roman governor used to rule. Your life, day to day, does not change much. The wheat ripens, the wine is harvested, the children grow, the old people die. But somewhere, far from your village, something is shifting. The Roman world your grandfather knew, the world in which Rome was eternal, and the emperor was the master of all civilized lands, is becoming a different world, quietly. Year by year. By the time you are old, your grandchildren will speak a language that is no longer quite Latin. They will pay their taxes to a Gothic king, or a Frankish chieftain, or a Vandal lord. They will not have seen a Roman soldier in their lives. The fall of Rome, for most of the people who lived through it, was not a single event. It was a slow change in the air, a growing thinness in the things that had been thick, a gradual loosening of the bonds that had held the world together for 500 years. For most people, this change was not a tragedy. It was simply life. They went on, they farmed, they prayed, they buried their dead. They forgot gradually what an emperor was. But for the cities, and for those who lived in the cities, and for those who tried to govern an empire from the cities, the change was more visible. In the late 4th century, a new leader emerged among the Goths who had settled decades earlier, after Adrianople. A young Gothic nobleman, born in the Roman province of Dacia, raised at the edge of the empire, fluent in Latin, baptized as a Christian. His name was Alaric. Alaric was not at first an enemy of Rome. He served as a Roman general. He commanded Gothic auxiliaries in the Roman army. He fought alongside Roman troops in civil wars between rival Roman emperors. He expected in return for his loyalty to be promoted, to be honored, to be rewarded with high office. He was not. The Roman aristocracy in the eastern court of Constantinople and in the western court of Milan looked down on him. He was a barbarian, they said. He was a Goth. He was Christian, but the wrong kind of Christian, an Arian, a follower of a heretical theology that had been condemned by the imperial church. He could fight for Rome. He could die for Rome, but he could not be of Rome. Alaric slowly lost his patience. In the year 401, 75 years before our story, he led his Gothic followers across the Alps and into Italy. He did not, at first, attack Rome itself. He demanded from the Western Emperor payment of arrears, land for his people, recognition of his rank. The Western Emperor was a young man named Honorius, a weak, ineffective ruler who spent most of his reign in the fortified palace city of Ravenna, where he kept chickens as pets. Honorius refused to negotiate. The Roman general Stilicho, himself half Vandal, the son of a Roman officer and a Vandal mother, managed Alaric's invasion through a combination of battle and diplomacy. The Goths were turned back. The crisis passed. But Honorius, in the year 408, made a mistake. Suspecting Stilicho of treachery, wrongly, Honorius had his greatest general executed. Stilicho was killed in the courtyard of a church. His Gothic auxiliaries, who had served him faithfully, mutinied. Many of them deserted to Alaric. And Alaric, for the third and final time, marched on Rome itself. He arrived at the walls in the autumn of 409. He blockaded the city. The Romans starved. They sent ambassadors begging for terms. Alaric demanded gold, silver, silk, pepper. The Romans paid. Alaric withdrew. He demanded more. The Romans refused. On the night of the 24th of August, in the year 410, 66 years before our story, somebody opened the Salarian gate of Rome from the inside. We do not know who, perhaps a slave, perhaps a sympathetic citizen, perhaps an agent of Alaric who had been working for months. The Goths poured in. For 3 days they sacked the city. Pause for a moment before the sack itself on the death of Stilicho. Stilicho had been, for 2 decades, the man who held the Western Empire together. He was a soldier of mixed blood, his father a Vandal officer who had served Rome, his mother a Roman woman of senatorial family. He had risen through the army on merit. He had married into the imperial family. His wife was the niece of the great emperor Theodosius I. When Theodosius died in 395, Stilicho was named guardian of the young emperors, East and West. The 2 boys, Arcadius and Honorius, were 11 and 10 years old. For 13 years, Stilicho was the real ruler of the Western Empire. He was 50 years old in the year 408. He had defeated Alaric 3 times. He had defeated Radagaisus, another Gothic leader, when that leader had crossed into Italy with 250,000 followers. He had held the Rhine frontier, barely, when the Vandals and other tribes broke across it in 406. He was, by any reasonable measure, the last great Roman general of the West. His own son, Eucharius, was being raised at court, expected to follow his father into high command. And then Honorius, the young emperor, by now 23 years old, but still under the influence of court intriguers, was persuaded that Stilicho was plotting to put Eucharius on the imperial throne. It was almost certainly a lie. Stilicho had served the imperial family with absolute loyalty for over 20 years, but the rumor was useful to a faction of the court. Honorius gave the order. In August of 408, Stilicho was arrested. He took refuge in a church in Ravenna. The bishop of the city negotiated with the imperial agents. They promised that if he came out, his life would be spared. He came out. They executed him on the spot. His son Eucharius, just a young man, fled to Rome. 3 months later, imperial agents found him there. He too was killed. The death of Stilicho was a kind of suicide for the Western Empire. The army that had served him, much of it composed of Gothic, Vandal, and other Germanic auxiliaries, was now without a leader who understood them. Tens of thousands of soldiers in towns and garrisons across Italy were stripped of their property by imperial decree. Their wives and children were massacred in some places by mobs of Italian citizens, encouraged by the imperial court, who hated and feared them. The survivors fled. They went to Alaric. They said, "We will fight for you now. The Romans have shown us what they think of us." Alaric's army, which had been perhaps 30,000 men in 408, swelled to perhaps 100,000 in the months that followed. He marched on Rome. If Honorius had not killed Stilicho, if he had trusted the half-Vandal general who had served him faithfully, Rome might not have fallen in 410. The empire might have endured for centuries longer in some recognizable form. We will never know. Sometimes in history, a single bad decision changes the shape of everything. The sack of Rome in 410 was, by ancient standards, a relatively gentle one. Alaric was a Christian. He had given orders that the great churches were to be respected. He had given orders that women were not to be assaulted. He had given orders that the city was not to be burned. His orders were partially obeyed. The churches were mostly spared. Some women were taken away by the Goths to be slaves and concubines. Some buildings burned. Some Romans were tortured for the locations of hidden gold. Some senators were killed. But the city itself, the actual streets and houses and aqueducts and temples and forums, mostly survived. After 3 days, Alaric ordered the Goths to leave. They marched out, carrying with them the wealth of 1,000 years. The shock, however, was beyond anything material. Rome had not been sacked in 800 years. Not since Brennus the Gaul had taken the city in 390 before Christ. For 30 generations the great rule had held, enemies of Rome might burn cities, might kill senators, might destroy armies. But Rome itself, the eternal city, was untouchable. Rome was the world. Rome was civilization. Rome was the gods. And now Rome had been taken by a Gothic Christian in 3 days, with almost no resistance. When the news reached the Eastern Empire, the Emperor Theodosius II, then a child, ordered 3 days of public mourning. When the news reached the African province of Hippo, modern Annaba in Algeria, an aging Christian bishop named Augustine sat down to write a book. The book would be called The City of God. It would take Augustine 15 years to finish. It would become one of the foundational texts of Western Christianity. Augustine was responding, in part, to a question that was being asked in panicked tones all across the empire. Why had this happened? The pagans of Rome blamed the Christians. They said the city was protected by the old gods, and we abandoned them, And now look, the Christians blamed the pagans, or the sins of the people, or the corruption of the empire. Everyone blamed someone. Augustine, sitting in his study in Hippo, blamed nobody and everybody. His answer was complicated, philosophical, theological. The cities of men, he wrote, were temporary. They rose and fell because they were of this world. The only city that mattered, the only city that lasted, was the city of God. His message in time was the one that survived. Rome had fallen because it was not eternal. Nothing in this world was eternal. Christians should not weep for the city of marble and gold. They should look toward the city that did not fall. It was a beautiful answer. It was also, perhaps, the only kind of answer that could be given. The world Romans had inherited, the world in which Rome was the center of civilization, was over. The world that came next would be something different. Among the Romans whom Alaric's Goths carried away from the sacked city was a young woman of the imperial family. Her name was Galla Placidia. She was perhaps 20 years old. She was the daughter of the Emperor Theodosius I, the half-sister of the reigning Emperor Honorius. She was, in the strange politics of the late empire, one of the most valuable hostages anyone could possess. The Goths took her with them when they left Rome. They carried her south into the toe of Italy, where Alaric died of fever just months after taking the city, before he could cross to North Africa. His Goths buried him, the legend says, in the bed of a small river called the Busento, after diverting the water and then returning it to its course, so that no enemy would ever find his grave. The new Gothic king was Alaric's brother-in-law, a man named Athaulf. Athaulf inherited Galla Placidia along with the rest of Alaric's possessions. He took her north with his army into Gaul, and then, to the astonishment of everyone, he married her. The marriage was held in the city of Narbonne in southern Gaul in January of 414. Galla Placidia wore Roman dress. Athaulf wore the cloak of a Roman general. The wedding songs were sung in both Latin and Gothic. A Roman senator gave a speech about the union of Roman civilization with Gothic strength. It was a vision of what might have been, a future in which the Romans and the Goths merged into a single people, ruled by a single line of mixed-blood kings, half Roman, half Gothic, Christian, civilized, and strong enough to hold the borders. It did not happen. Athaulf was assassinated by his own followers in 415, just over a year after the wedding. The infant son he had with Galla Placidia died shortly after. The new Gothic king made a deal with the Roman court. Galla Placidia was returned to her brother Honorius in exchange for grain. She was perhaps 26 years old. She had been a queen. She had been a widow. She had buried a child. She returned to Ravenna, where she would eventually be married to a Roman general, would bear an emperor, her son Valentinian III, and would, for 2 decades, be one of the most powerful figures in the Western Empire. Her tomb is still there. In the city of Ravenna, in a small brick mausoleum with a ceiling of brilliant blue mosaic, gold stars on a field of cobalt, she is supposed to rest. The mausoleum has been dated to her lifetime. The interior has survived, almost untouched, for 1,600 years. You can stand inside it today and look up at the blue ceiling and remember that this was the woman who saw Rome sacked, was taken to Gaul as a captive, married a Gothic king, returned to her brother's court, and for a brief moment held the empire together in a way few others could. The blue mosaic survives. The empire she helped to hold together did not. For a generation after Alaric's sack, Rome staggered on. Other peoples followed Alaric. The Vandals, pushed out of Central Europe by the Huns, crossed the Rhine in the winter of 406, when the river was frozen. They moved south, through Gaul, into Spain. They crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. They arrived in North Africa, Rome's richest province, the source of most of the empire's grain. And they took it, piece by piece, over 20 years. By the year 440, the Vandals were in Carthage. The Mediterranean Sea, which had been a Roman lake for 500 years, was now patrolled by Vandal ships. And then, behind the Goths and the Vandals and the Burgundians and the Franks and the Alans, behind all the Germanic peoples who had been pushed west by terror, came the source of the terror itself: the Huns. Their leader, by the year 440, was a man named Attila. Attila was, even by Hunnish standards, ferocious. He had killed his own brother to take sole rule of his people. He had built, in the plains beyond the Danube, a vast confederation of nomadic tribes. He could put 100,000 mounted archers in the field. He could move them across distances that astonished the Romans in days. In the year 447, Attila attacked the Eastern Empire. He sacked dozens of cities in the Balkans. He came within sight of the walls of Constantinople. The Eastern Emperor paid him an enormous tribute, perhaps 2,000 pounds of gold a year, to make him go away. Attila went away. He turned west. In the year 451, Attila invaded Gaul. The Western Emperor was now Valentinian III, Galla Placidia's son, a weak, vain man whose sister, Honoria, had, for reasons that are still debated, sent Attila a letter and a ring, possibly proposing marriage. Attila had taken the proposal seriously. He demanded half the Western Empire as Honoria's dowry. Valentinian refused. Attila invaded. The decisive battle was fought at the Catalonian plains in modern France. The Roman general was a man named Aetius, the last of the great Roman commanders, a man who had spent his youth as a hostage of the Huns and who knew Attila personally. Aetius cobbled together a coalition: Roman troops, Visigothic warriors under their king Theodoric, Burgundians, Franks, even some Alans. The battle was huge. The Visigothic king Theodoric was killed in the fighting. Aetius held the field. Attila withdrew. It was the first major defeat of Attila's life. 2 years later, in 453, Attila married a young Germanic bride. He celebrated the wedding with a great feast. He drank heavily. That night, in his tent, he died, of a nosebleed, the sources say, choking on his own blood. His empire dissolved within a few years. The Hunnish threat, which had pressed so hard on Europe for half a century, was over. Well, Rome's troubles were not. In the year 454, the Emperor Valentinian, perhaps fearing that Aetius, his great general, was becoming too powerful, assassinated Aetius with his own hand in the imperial palace. A senator, watching, said to the emperor, "I do not know what motives have led you to this act, but I know that you have just cut off your right hand with your left." He was right. 6 months later, in March of 455, Valentinian was himself murdered by 2 of Aetius's old soldiers in revenge for their general. The Theodosian dynasty, which had ruled the West for 80 years, was over. What followed was chaos. In 2 months, 3 different men claimed the imperial throne. The first was a senator named Petronius Maximus. He had himself proclaimed emperor in May. He forced Valentinian's widow, the Empress Eudoxia, to marry him. Eudoxia, in fury, sent a message to Carthage. She invited the Vandals to come. The Vandal king, Genseric, had been waiting his whole life for an opportunity like this. He gathered his fleet. He sailed across the Mediterranean. He landed at the mouth of the Tiber. He marched up the river. Petronius Maximus, learning of the approach, panicked and tried to flee the city. He was killed by a mob, beaten to death in the streets, his body thrown into the Tiber. The Vandals entered Rome on the 2nd of June, 455. There was nobody to defend the city. The Pope, Leo the Great, met Genseric outside the walls and begged him not to burn Rome and not to massacre its people. Genseric agreed. For 2 weeks the Vandals plundered the city. This was a more thorough sack than Alaric's 45 years earlier. The Vandals were not Christians of the Roman kind. They had no orders to spare the churches. They took everything that could be carried: gold, silver, jewels, statues, vessels, furniture. They stripped the gilded copper tiles from the roof of the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, tiles that had stood there for 600 years. They took, the sources say, the menorah of the Temple of Jerusalem, which had been carried to Rome by the Emperor Titus 400 years earlier. They took the Empress Eudoxia herself, who had invited them. They took her 2 daughters. They took thousands of Roman citizens as slaves. After 2 weeks, they sailed back to Carthage with their loot. This second sack of Rome, the Vandal sack of 455, was in many ways more devastating than Alaric's. The city had recovered sort of from 410. It would recover in some sense from 455. But the recovery was thinner. The buildings that had been damaged were not all rebuilt. The treasures that had been taken were not all replaced. The population, which had once been 1 million, had fallen by 455 to perhaps 150,000. The empire had 21 years left. The capital of the Western Empire in these final decades was no longer Rome. It had been moved more than 50 years earlier, in the year 402, just before Alaric's first invasion, to a small city on the Adriatic coast of Italy. A city that had been, in earlier centuries, a minor port, a city called Ravenna. Ravenna was chosen for one reason: it was almost impossible to attack. The city sat in the middle of a vast salt marsh, a network of lagoons and tidal flats and reed beds, drained by a slow brown river. The land around it was so flat, so wet, so impassable that no army could approach it overland in any season. The only access was by a narrow causeway from the south, easy to defend, or by sea, where the Adriatic fleet of the empire patrolled. Honorius had moved his court there in fear of the Goths. He had stayed there. His successors had stayed. By the time of Romulus Augustulus, Ravenna had been the imperial capital for 74 years. It had grown in those decades into a city of marble palaces, gilded basilicas, monasteries, and elaborate mosaic workshops. The Western emperors built it up because they had nowhere else to go, and because the Eastern court, in Constantinople, was building up its own glittering capital, and they did not want to be outshone. Today, Ravenna is a quiet provincial city in northern Italy. The marshes have been drained. The sea has retreated. The city itself, once on the coast, is now miles inland. but the buildings of the Roman and early Byzantine period have survived in extraordinary numbers. There are 8 UNESCO World Heritage Sites within the small historic core, more than in any other city of its size in the world. You can walk through the Basilica of San Vitale and look up at the mosaic of the Emperor Justinian. Though Justinian himself never came to Ravenna, the mosaic was made for him by craftsmen who had probably never seen the emperor. You can stand in the mausoleum of Galla Placidia and look up at the blue ceiling. You can stand in the Arian baptistery, built by Theodoric the Ostrogoth, a generation after Romulus Augustulus, and see where Christ is being baptized in a mosaic that survives, intact, 15 centuries later. This was the city where, in early September of 476, the last emperor of the West was waiting for news from the front. His father had marched north to meet a barbarian general. The barbarian general had won. His father was dead. The barbarian general was now coming for him. He waited in his palace in the marsh city for the sound of approaching soldiers. In the 21 years after the Vandal sack, the Western Empire was ruled by a succession of weak, short-lived, often murdered emperors. Most of them were figureheads. The real power, by this point, lay with the Germanic generals who commanded the Roman army. The pattern, in those 21 years, was almost a ritual. A senator or general would proclaim a new emperor. The new emperor would rule for a few months or a few years. He would quarrel with his Germanic master of soldiers. He would be deposed or murdered or forced to abdicate. A new emperor would be proclaimed. The cycle would begin again. Their names blur together in the histories. Avitus, Majorian, Libius Severus, Anthemius, Olybrius, Glycerius, Julius Nepos. Most of them were honorable men, doing the best they could in impossible circumstances. 2, Majorian and Anthemius, were genuinely capable rulers who tried to reverse the empire's decline. Both failed. Both were killed by the same general, a half-Visigothic, half-Suebian commander named Ricimer, who effectively ruled the West for 16 years through a series of imperial puppets. Ricimer himself died in 472. His successors were no more successful at finding a stable arrangement. By 475, the Western Empire was, in any meaningful sense, an empty title. The emperor in Ravenna had no army of his own. He had no province of his own. He had no money of his own. He existed, the histories suggest, only because there had always been a Western emperor, and nobody had quite worked up the nerve to do without one. In the autumn of 475, a Roman general named Orestes, once a young Pannonian nobleman, once a secretary to Attila the Hun himself, now an aging veteran of half a century of Roman wars, overthrew the latest emperor, Julius Nepos, and drove him out of Italy. Orestes did not, however, take the throne himself. Instead, on the 31st of October, 475, Orestes had his son crowned emperor. The boy was perhaps 14 years old. Some sources say 16. He was small, pale, frightened. He had grown up in the courts of his father's allies, first the Hunnish court, then the Roman court at Ravenna. He had never given a speech, never led an army, never made a political decision in his life. He had 2 names. His father had named him after his grandfather. The grandfather had been a Roman senator from the province of Pannonia, with an unusual old-fashioned name from the early days of the Republic, Romulus, like the founder of Rome. When the boy was crowned emperor, he took the imperial title, Augustus. like the first emperor of Rome. The historians of the time noticed the irony immediately. The last emperor of Rome had the same names as the first king of Rome and the first emperor of Rome. Romulus, who had founded the city 1,200 years earlier. Augustus, who had founded the empire 500 years earlier. The two names together in one frightened teenage boy sitting on a throne in a swamp city by the Adriatic Sea. The Romans gave him a nickname. They added a diminutive suffix to his second name. They called him not Augustus, but Augustulus, Little Augustus. The reign of Romulus Augustulus lasted 10 months and 4 days. We know almost nothing about it. There are no laws of his that survive. There are no inscriptions. There is no record of any policy he attempted, any ambassador he received, any speech he gave. Some coins were minted in his name. A few hundred have survived, scattered in museums across Europe. But they are nearly identical to the coins of his predecessors. The emperor on the obverse looks like every other emperor of the period. He could be 16. He could be 60. He is just a face on a coin. What we do know is that Romulus Augustulus did not rule. His father Orestes ruled in his name. And Orestes, in the spring and summer of 476, was running out of options. The army of Italy, the last Roman army in the West, was now composed almost entirely of Germanic soldiers, Heruli, Scyrians, Tertullingians. They were Roman soldiers in the technical sense. They wore Roman uniforms. They fought in Roman formations. They were paid in Roman coin. But they were Germanic men with Germanic loyalties, fighting for a Roman state that, increasingly, gave them less than they expected. In the late summer of 476, the Germanic soldiers came to Orestes with a demand. They wanted land. Specifically, they wanted a third of the land of Italy, to be settled on, to farm, to become, finally, landowners, and not just paid soldiers. This was the same arrangement that had been made with the Visigoths decades earlier in southern Gaul, the same arrangement that had been made with the Burgundians, the same arrangement that had been made with the Vandals in Africa. It was, by the standards of late Roman politics, a modest demand. It would have ended Italy as a Roman territory in any meaningful sense. A third of the land would have passed, permanently, into Germanic hands, but it would have kept the empire technically alive, with its emperor and its senate and its forms. Orestes refused. Why he refused we do not know. Perhaps he hoped to negotiate from strength. Perhaps he believed that the Germanic soldiers were bluffing. Perhaps he was simply too proud or too old or too tired to give up the last shred of what Rome had been. The soldiers turned then to another general, a man of their own kind, a man who had served alongside Orestes for years, who knew him well, who had once been his friend. His name was Odoacer. We do not know exactly what tribe Odoacer was from. The sources call him a Syrian, a Hun, a Goth. He was probably a mixture. He had served in the Roman army for decades. He spoke Latin. He was a Christian, an Arian Christian, like most of his soldiers. He was perhaps 43 years old in the year 476. The soldiers asked Odoacer to lead them. He agreed. On the 28th of August, 476, Odoacer's army defeated Orestes at the city of Ticinum in northern Italy. Orestes fled into the city. The city was besieged. The walls were breached. Orestes was captured. He was executed the same day. His brother Paulus, defending the imperial capital of Ravenna, was killed in the fighting a few days later. On the morning of the 4th of September, 476, Odoacer's soldiers entered Ravenna. The boy emperor was waiting. What happened in the imperial palace of Ravenna on the 4th of September, 476, we can only partly reconstruct. There were no contemporary witnesses who recorded the scene. The accounts come from later sources, written years or decades after the event, drawing on traditions whose accuracy we cannot fully verify. But the broad outline is clear. Romulus Augustulus, perhaps 15 years old, perhaps a little older, was brought before Odoacer in the great hall of the palace. He was, by all accounts, terrified. He had just learned that his father was dead. His uncle was dead. The army that should have protected him had betrayed him. The soldiers who guarded the palace now answered to a man he did not know. Odoacer was, by the accounts, gentle with him. The boy was made to formally abdicate. He took off the purple cloak of imperial office. He took off the crown. He set them down on a low table. He renounced, in a few sentences, the throne of the Western Roman Empire. Odoacer asked him a question, perhaps about his family, perhaps about where he would like to go. The boy answered. Some sources say he wept. Odoacer made a decision. He would not kill the boy. This was, by the standards of 5th century politics, an unusual decision. Deposed emperors were almost always killed. It was simply the safer course. A living former emperor was a focus for revolt. A dead former emperor was an end to the question. But Odoacer chose mercy. Perhaps because the boy was young, perhaps because he had never really ruled, never really committed any crime, never really been emperor in any sense that mattered. Perhaps because Odoacer, who had spent his life in the Roman army, had a soldier's contempt for cruelty toward the helpless. He gave the boy a pension, 6,000 solidi a year, a substantial sum, enough to live well on. He sent him to live in Campania, in the south of Italy, with his maternal relatives. He gave him a villa, the Lucullan Villa, near modern Naples, which had once belonged to a Roman general of the late Republic, 400 years earlier. The boy was last heard of, perhaps, around the year 507, when a letter from a later king of Italy, the Ostrogoth Theodoric, referred to Romulus receiving his pension. By that time, the boy who had been the last emperor of Rome would have been in his 40s. Where he died, we do not know. When he died, we do not know. He simply, slowly faded out of history. Meanwhile, in Ravenna, Odoacer did something that surprised everyone. He did not declare himself emperor. He gathered the imperial insignia of the West, the diadem, the purple robe, the scepter, the orb, and he packed them in a wooden chest. He wrote a letter to the emperor of the East, Zeno, in Constantinople. The Western Empire, he wrote, no longer needed its own emperor. One emperor in Constantinople was enough. The West would, henceforth, be ruled by Zeno's representative. Odoacer requested that he be given the title of patrician, a noble Roman rank, and recognized as the imperial governor of Italy. Zeno was not happy. He had hoped, when the news of Romulus Augustulus's deposition reached him, that the rightful Western emperor, Julius Nepos, the man whom Orestes had overthrown the year before, would be restored. He told Odoacer to acknowledge Nepos. Odoacer politely ignored the suggestion. He ruled Italy as king, in Roman dress, with Roman law, with the Roman Senate still meeting in Rome and minting coins in his name. He called himself sometimes Rex, king. He called himself sometimes patrician. He never called himself emperor. He did not need to. The Western Empire on the 4th of September, 476, had ended. Not with a battle, not with a sack, not with a final dramatic catastrophe. It had ended with a teenage boy taking off a crown and a barbarian general accepting the gesture, and a wooden chest of regalia being sent east to a city the boy emperor had never seen. In the centuries that followed, the date became famous. The 4th of September, 476. The day Rome fell. It became famous slowly. The contemporaries did not see it that way. Most of them did not even notice. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus received almost no attention in the chronicles of the time. There had been so many emperors deposed in the previous decades that one more, even the last one, hardly seemed remarkable. The Roman state, in some sense, continued. Under Odoacer, then under Theodoric the Ostrogoth, then under the Byzantine reconquest, then under the Lombards. The Senate of Rome continued to meet for another century. Latin continued to be spoken. The roads continued to be used. The aqueducts continued to flow in some cities for hundreds of years more. The fall of Rome, when it came to be called the fall of Rome, was a label applied long afterward, by historians looking back, trying to find a date for the moment when the ancient world ended and the medieval world began. The English historian Edward Gibbon, 1500 years after, would write a book, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, that would fix the date in Western imagination. Gibbon picked 476 because it was clean. There was a last emperor. He had a memorable name. He was a child. He was deposed by a barbarian. The story had the shape of a story. The truth, as the Romans of the time understood it, was less clean. The empire had been falling for 2 centuries. It would continue in some form for centuries more. The fall was not an event. It was a process. A slow, complicated, ambiguous process, more like a long autumn than a sudden death. But the date stuck. The 4th of September, 476, became the day that Rome fell, and Romulus Augustulus, a frightened teenage boy who had ruled for 10 months and never given a speech and never made a decision, became the last emperor of Rome. Tonight, 1500 years later, you can still walk through the bones of his empire. You can stand in Ravenna in the palace where he abdicated. The palace itself is gone, but the city survives, with its great Byzantine churches, its mosaic ceilings, its mausoleum of Galla Placidia, where the imperial family of the early 5th century lies buried. The streets where Odoacer's soldiers walked on the morning of the 4th of September are still walked today by Italian commuters, by tourists, by old women carrying bread. You can stand in Rome itself in the Forum where the Senate met for 1,000 years. The marble is broken now. The columns are broken. The temples are roofless and quiet. But the foundations are there. The shapes are there. You can still trace with your eye the path that a senator would have walked, from the steps of the Senate House to the rostrum, to give a speech. You can stand in the Pantheon, the great domed temple built by Hadrian, which survived because it was converted into a church. You can stand in the Colosseum, where Nero's lake used to be. You can stand at the Largo di Torre Argentina, where Caesar fell. You can stand on the Palatine Hill, where the imperial palaces stood. The empire's cities are still cities. The empire's languages, Latin, transformed into Italian, Spanish, French, Romanian, are still spoken. The empire's laws are still the foundation of the legal systems of half the world. The empire, in some sense, never quite fell. It transformed. It dissolved into the Middle Ages. It became Christendom. It became, eventually, the modern Western world. But the empire of marble and gold, the empire of legions and emperors, of Caesar and Augustus and Nero, of Pompey and the great fire of Rome, that empire, on a quiet morning in September, 1550 years ago, came to its final, formal, gentle end. A boy took off a crown. A general accepted it. A chest was packed and sent east. The Roman Empire of the West was over. It is late now. Close your eyes. Let the empire rest. Let Romulus Augustulus rest in the warm sunlight of his Campanian villa, an old man with a pension and a memory of being, briefly, a child on a throne. Let Odoacer rest, who would himself be killed 16 years later by a Gothic king named Theodoric. Let Alaric rest in the bed of his hidden river. Let Augustine rest, who watched the city of God rise from the ashes of the city of man. Let all of them, the emperors and the barbarians, the soldiers and the senators, the Christians and the pagans, the slaves and the saints, let all of them finally rest. Let the long autumn of the Roman Empire drift away.